Very nice to be here with you, and thank you for this invitation to continue this discussion. I will take a bit of a different approach to what we've talked about thus far, and we'll present you a few ideas to think about as we travel across what I call the matryoshka phenomenon and talking about strategic communication during pandemic. So my goal today is to really discuss with you the multi-body problem, what I call our multi-body problem that we face today at the universities around the world. And I want to demonstrate how this problem is really very much connected with the matryoshka phenomenon, an idea that I have developed recently in relation to understanding better strategic communication. And then we'll focus on understanding the differences in communication during pandemic, and finally see if we can address solving the multi-body problem. So what do I mean by a multi-body problem? You may or may not be familiar with a sci-fi novel that has been written by a famous Chinese fiction writer, sci-fi fiction writer, that is called the three-body problem, and it has made big waves in the sci-fi world several years ago. It was the very first sci-fi novel that really got wide attention in the English language world from a Chinese sci-fi writer. I thought it would be interesting to play with the words of a three-body problem and really think about our conversation and our world today as a multi-body problem, and particularly a world of education and institute. You know, the first thing that the group of problems, if you wish, is the idea of how do we deliver our instructions at the universities. Here in the University of Oklahoma in the United States, this semester, we actually had three different types of delivery: online only, hybrid, which means some classes are taught online and some classes are taught in person, and complete in-person classes. And even with in-person classes, students had an opportunity to either come to class in person physically, or they could join Zoom. So professors had to adapt and address needs of both types of students, those who wanted face-to-face learning and also those who did not feel comfortable maybe coming or for some other reasons could not, and then they needed to connect online. And that presented an array of challenges for many of our instructors and professors, as well as students, who really had to suddenly make sure that they have this multi-body understanding of what's happening, whether you're online, in person, or hybrid, multiple connections, multiple channels of communication. The second set of problems that really came with this transition during pandemic at the university education level is really technological gadgets. We suddenly realized that a lot of our technology hardware that we have is no longer suitable for what we really need to do if we teach online or if we spend so many hours on Zoom in front of cameras. Here at the University of Oklahoma, we were fortunate enough to receive additional help from the technology office, for example, and the university made the commitment to order additional pieces of equipment for the professors and instructors who needed, so we could get additional cameras, microphones, external microphones, the docu cameras that allow you to read pieces of paper and translate them into the digital copies. I had to get additional light fixture to use during our Zoom meetings. I never really thought about the opportunities to do that, so many of the, involved in using so many gadgets before this pandemic. Students had the same issue. Many of them had to get new computers if they're fortunate enough to have the opportunity to buy new technology, or they had to adjust and adapt in terms of what kinds of gadgets that they can use to really complete their online education. The next one is technology literacy versus the quality of connection. Let me talk about that one. The quality of connection is also a multi-body problem, or part of the multi-body problem rather, because what happens here is that the quality of connection makes this conversation much more difficult. Previous speakers talked about the uneven distribution of a high-speed internet connection, but we don't even need to go to Africa to see that. You know, the internet connection here, for example, in Oklahoma, is penetrated and is available, but it's really patchy in terms of high-speed connection. So technologies such as Zoom, if you want that technology to work, you really have to be in a place where that Wi-Fi is strong enough. And sometimes, and in many ways, in my case of my students, in small rural areas where they live in Oklahoma, they don't have that strong of a connection to really support the video feed from Zoom. So they have to travel either to a library nearby, or they have to go to a friend's house or somebody else's place, or really go to the university campus to get that connection. Technology literacy versus technology comprehension is another one that I want to point out here. So we all think about ourselves as being technologically literate now, because what happens is that we think about technological literacy, and we understand the basics of how to use the technology, how to think about how to click the Zoom and figure it out. But there's a next level of, just as we talk about reading literacy versus reading comprehension, there's a next level to technology comprehension, to really understand the advanced features, to think about the ways of how we can make meaningful engagements via technology. And that's a really next level that requires a lot of energy, a lot of time to learn. And of course, if we have not had experiences with that technology before, it's very difficult to learn. Different people learn differently. Different people are different adapters, from early adapters all the way to late adapters. So that also separates and kind of further divides us, and really creates an additional dimension to this multi-body problem. And finally, the idea that the work, family, and life are so intertwined now, and we can't really easily divide that. I mean, we see that in our homes and have to organize home offices to really work successfully during pandemic. And at any moment, the door behind me can open, and some member of my family will storm in and start asking and demanding attention. And it's really difficult to comprehend, I think, and understand to the extent possible, how do we really reconcile our work, family, and life nowadays when we do work from home. So this is what I call really a matryoshka phenomenon. It's a multi-layered communication that we really need to engage in as we think about communication, and as we think about the ways to understand the ways how we think in our work during pandemic and our life during pandemic. Why is it matryoshka phenomenon? I really like this analogy that I use for, not really metaphor that I use for understanding strategic communication messages, and it's very well situated to understand our multi-body problem. Our communication always is multi-layered because of all these challenges I mentioned before. On the surface, it looks just like one doll. We want to communicate, we want to spread knowledge, and we want to create as much of a normalcy in this uncertain times as possible. But the truth of the matter is that we do have many, many layers of communication that happen during our conversations with colleagues, with students, with everybody who is around us, right? We may say one thing, but then there are lots of other things that really follow. And until you keep opening these matryoshkas and keep figuring out what are the other layers of communication, it's really difficult to understand the complexity and comprehensive point of this communication. So that means that a lot of times when we communicate with each other in the university settings, when we communicate with our students, when we communicate with our colleagues, when we communicate with our peers, we do have, and even during this communication, during the conference, we do have multiple layers of communication that we really need to be aware and we really need to understand. In our recent work with my colleagues, we talked about this grid of understanding differences in strategic communication, which I think is also very applicable to understanding our differences during communication during pandemic, and particularly in the university context. A lot of times we will have transparent communication and all the way to non-transparent communication. So in other words, we can have all our ideas up on the table, but then all the way on the spectrum to probably hiding something for particular reasons. And another dimension here is the strategic communication all the way to non-strategic or opportunistic communication. As we engage in communication at the university with our students, for example, we have a very particular goal in mind when we communicate, and we a lot of times create the strategic messages for our students or for our peers, for our colleagues, or for our administration. The same thing goes to any other member of publics or stakeholders within the university. They all may have specific strategic communication messages for us. But in times of pandemic, especially nowadays, we did notice that a lot of this communication become more spontaneous and then more opportunistic. And the very fact that we do have all these problems we mentioned create an opportunity for us to engage in opportunistic communication, things that we have not planned, things that we didn't think about before. And we really want to take advantage of the opportunity in time and place and discuss specific issues, specific topics, or things that are happening today with our colleagues, with our peers, with our students, to demonstrate how this really can affect our life and how can affect our understanding of the subject down the line. So when we think about differences in strategic communication pandemic, I would argue that pandemic situation really forces us in many ways to think more about non-strategic opportunistic communication opportunities, and also really forces us to think about the ways of how we can make our communication more transparent, precisely because of multi-layered matryoshkas that we need to open. So the next thing that I wanted to discuss is that I wanted to bring your attention to this table that compares the Western communication differences and Russian communication differences. We use this in the chapter, speaking of the world-life balance, right here. Давай попозже, окей? Давай попозже. Я сейчас презентую на конференции, окей? Да, ну вот как вы видите.
Yes. Exactly.
Работа и все
вместе. Yes, so what you're saying right now, yeah.
Yes, life, work, and family. So let me just spend a little bit time on this table here, because what I think is that we can take some interesting points from this. We use this to discuss the differences in communication between Western and Russian strategic communicators. But I think it's very good one to also think about the ways of how we communicate at the universities in the Western and in the Russian environment. I'd be happy and interested to hear your thoughts about that as well. So the several types of things that we need to think about: order, audience, source, context, probing, transparency, and strategy. I'll stop just on the few that I think are most important for us. So the first one is the audience. A lot of times messages that are targeted specifically to stakeholders are separated to internal and external stakeholders in Western communication. A lot of times that's kind of a staple. You have to have different messages for different stakeholders. You definitely want to make sure you understand it. Although sometimes both can utilize it, you really want to have a very specific understanding of who these audiences are. And a lot of times in communications, in strategic communication in the Russian context, we see that those really external messages resonate very well with internal publics, and we have to make sure that they do resonate. I think that's something that we see increasingly changing also for the Western communication here at the universities, where a lot of times when something the university communicates about the pandemic or the next semester, for example, to the world outside, it also needs to resonate with internal communication, so it's not in the conflict. Another one is the context. I think context a lot of times plays the supportive role to a message in the Western sense, and in a lot of times in communications in the high contextual environments, in many environments in Russia and many non-Western environments, context and presentation may often really deliver and define the message. It's very important to understand under which circumstances this message comes to life. We discussed transparency, so one more thing that I'm going to stop on is strategy. I want to emphasize an interesting point in the term that is called strategic ambiguity. And in many of Russian context communication, strategic communication especially, strategic ambiguity is used very actively. It's really central to communication. That means that this is something that you do not necessarily deliver clearly and sharply. You leave some ambiguity in the message to really help you navigate of what may happen next with this message. In the Western world and in general in Anglo-Saxon world, it's very difficult to do that because your strategic communication messages require clarity, and just English language, if you wish, in many ways requires clarity, and that's also one of those differences in communication. So how do we solve this multi-body problem in our situation and in our pandemic? How do we really think about all these challenges together, utilizing our knowledge of strategic communication and utilizing our understanding of how and what we need to do at the university level? Well, we really need to unpack our matryoshkas. We really need to look at the multiple elements of what it really takes right now to work during the pandemic in the online environments. We really need to also understand that what it takes to learn in this environment. It's not only about instructors and professors, teachers and administrators. It's also about students. It's about them who also have multiple matryoshkas and multiple layers, and help them to communicate these multiple layers, help them to open their own matryoshkas and learn about themselves, because only through learning about ourselves we can really better understand the other. So some takeaways. Let's deal with strategic ambiguity. Let's assume and let's welcome that strategic ambiguity, because right now, let's be honest, during pandemic, we all engaged in a lot of strategic ambiguity messages. We do not know define specific points. We do not know the final specific timelines or ideas of when everything gets resolved. A lot of our communication right now is strategically ambiguous, so we really need to deal with that. And I think our first step to understand it is to understand why certain messages are ambiguous. It's a good starting point to really unpack some of those matryoshkas and layers, whether it's technology-driven problems, as we discussed, comprehensiveness versus literacy, whether it's actual gadget hardware problem, or it's something more intangible and something more complex, such as family, work, life balance, or maybe even quality of information and exchanges. We also need to analyze possible reasons behind this ambiguity, why some messages can be ambiguous, why, for example, our students may not tell us directly what kinds of things they struggle with, or on the other hand, why we ourselves may not be as direct in some of our messaging, why administration may not be direct in some of the messages that they provide. And then we need to really achieve awareness. It may take some time for us to really work through this confusion and improve resilience. We are learning, and we have made huge progress in this in the last 10 months, kind of understanding what this pandemic really brings to the world, and we're all working through this together. So let's learn through our peers. Let's have these conferences like this one that really help us to dive in and really improve our resilience and how to understand it. It's good to see that we're all humans, right? I'm actually kind of glad that my little one stormed in, because we all see that that is happening with everyone, and that makes it even more real, I think, and more authentic in terms of communication and in terms of what we're trying to say. And then finally, let's say that uncertainty might be a strategy. It may be possible for us and useful for us to actually have that uncertainty situation and really embrace it and celebrate it. It's okay not to be straightforward. And I think that's the message that probably is more resonating with my Western colleagues. I think in many ways, our Russian colleagues may have mastered the way of what it really means to be strategically ambiguous and how to really survive in the levels of uncertainty. So some of these ideas and many of the ideas, I had to do a little plug here, are discussed in our new book that we published with Dean Krukerberg. It's called Strategic Communications in Russia, Public Relations and Advertising. It's a volume, edited volume of 15 chapters from 20 plus authors around the world, but most of them come from Russia, different universities in Russia, where we really discuss contemporary and modern trends and issues in public relations and advertising. And some of the ideas that I've discussed today are actually in this book and in chapters that I co-wrote. So with this in mind, thank you very much for listening